Matt Fradd, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me on.
So it's Dad meets Fradd here in Holy Week, heading into Easter, and I am a cradle Catholic who is coming back to actually paying attention to being Catholic, which when you're a cradle Catholic, often you don't pay that much attention to. You sort of you do your thing. I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and then I think like a lot of Catholics, I kind of left. I parked that not in the past per se, but
hmm
I sort of parked it in the back of my life and my identity. And now, as I approach 50,
Catholic school will do that to you.
Catholic school will do that to you. But I was so excited for the chance for us to speak because I think you are among sort of, I think, the leading voices in engaging the culture on behalf of the faith. You're the host of Pints with Aquinas. And for viewers who aren't familiar at all with what this week means,
Mm.
we intend to release this on Thursday, the day before Holy Thursday, before Good Friday, before Easter Sunday. Um, what does this week mean to Christians? Why is this week important?
Yeah, so the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ are what saves or redeems humanity. And so it's our holiest of weeks. We celebrated the triumphant entry of Christ into Jerusalem called Palm Sunday, yesterday
Yep.
on Sunday. And so we follow our blessed Lord throughout this most intense of weeks. We have the Last Supper and the washing of the disciples' feet, the agony in the garden, the arrest of the good Jesus, his torture and sentencing to death. We see the apostles, all but John, flee from him. So we see John and his mother, Mary Magdalene, at the cross. And then there's that awkward pause on Saturday where no one really knows what to do because we're not necessarily remembering the crucifixion and we're not yet at the resurrection. So we just sort of sit and we wait until we celebrate the resurrection of Christ.
The what do you say to the person who says something along the lines of, I don't know about Jesus coming back from the dead, but I think his teachings are great. He's a great moral teacher. And so I'm down with Jesus because I like what he has to say. But all this magical stuff about coming back from the dead and ascending into heaven, that all sounds, I don't know about any of that. How do you respond to somebody who feels like they're maybe a cultural Christian or just sort of a moral philosophy-ish Christian-ish? Are they
Yeah,
even a Christian?
there's a lot of interpretations on our Lord. Some say he's a moral teacher, some say like a political revolutionary, some say maybe merely a myth or what have you. All of these interpretations, other than the Christian one, seek to understand him apart from his divinity. So I would say that if Christ wasn't divine and if he didn't rise from the dead, then yeah, you're right not to believe that, not to want to believe that, perhaps. Um, so we could ask ourselves the question: do we have any good reasons to think that's the case? But one thing C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity is that given what Jesus said about himself, he's either who he says he is, namely the Lord, or he's a liar, or he's kind of nuts. There's really no fourth option. There's no way of really coming at him, respecting what he said, with this, to quote Lewis, patronizing nonsense of calling him a good moral teacher. I mean, he forgave people who didn't, sin against him personally if he wasn't the Lord. He said, "Before Abraham was, I am." He said all of these things. He was killed, handed over to the Romans for blasphemy, for claiming to be God. And so, if I claim to be God and I mean what I'm saying, then I don't think you should be calling me a good moral teacher. I think you should either say, "Well, he was lying, and he knew that he was lying," or he was nuts. Now, Gary Habermas, Dr. William Lane Craig, Trent Horn, and others, I think, have done some good work showing why the resurrection of Christ is the best explanation of the facts of the resurrection. This isn't something I'm studied up on, but whenever I listen to them, it makes sense to me. And
Yeah.
so I guess I would encourage somebody who says that sort of thing that no, I don't think you should call him a good moral teacher. And I would also say I think it's good that you don't just want to believe something that's false just because it makes you feel good. I agree with that sentiment. When I was young, I believed in Father Christmas, as we called him in Australia. And when I did, especially around December, I was better behaved and happier, probably. But just because something makes you moral and happy, that's not a good enough reason to believe it if it's false. So I think it's good that people want good answers to these things. They don't want to believe a lie. And I would say that there's good argumentation out there that they might be interested in looking into.
All right, real quick. If you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It lets YouTube know that you want to see more Dad Saves America, and it helps spread the word. So it's one of the best things you can do to support what we're doing. And now, back to the show. You know, one of the things that I think was maybe the last time it was brought into the broadest culture in America was with the movie The Passion of the Christ. The sheer brutality of the crucifixion. You know, anytime you go into a Catholic church and you see the image of Christ hanging on the cross, sometimes it can be beautiful. Sometimes it's like he's like this and he's looking great, but a lot of times he's laying head down, bleeding, and it's macabre. It's a brutal image. How do you think about that? How do you think about and I know you've written recently about sort of the way Thomas Aquinas talks about what we can learn from Christ on the cross, but it's a bizarre image objectively to say, here comes the Son of God, and our image will be him mutilated. You know.
Yeah, I think we live in a bizarre world, and it's far more bizarre than we've been led to believe. And so, how do I think of Christ on the cross? I like how Bishop Robert Barron put it in one of his recent sermons. He said, you know, the crucified God is what you find when the rebellion of human sin comes against him. He says, whether we consider the mass murderer or a sort of smaller but intentional, much smaller but intentional sin, they all have in common this rebellion against God and his law. And so on the cross, we see depicted what happens when the masks are taken off and the rebellion of man comes against the good God. And what we find is completely shocking. As St. Paul says, it's laughable to the Greeks, you know, and the Jews don't understand it either. What we find is the forgiveness of God, who sort of absorbs our sin and says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. To me, that's almost more bizarre that anyone would have that response than that Christians would hang these things in their churches. I agree with you that, you know, just like the background or the screensaver on your phone, you put it on the first day and you see it all the time. But a week later, you stop seeing it. Yeah. And I think Christians don't see the cross often because we see it all the time. It just becomes like background noise, which is why Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ and other depictions of him help us, like wake us up to the reality of what Christ went through.
I think I have a good friend who's he went through a period of time of being a born again Christian and now has a more, you could say, integral new age type of theology, let's say. And one of the things that he's always been challenged by is this question of evil. Like, why would the kind of God that Catholicism and Christianity puts forward, a loving God, a forgiving God, why would that kind of God create a world that's got so much misery in it? It's a very difficult challenge. How have you grappled with that? Because I this is part of my like middle-aged new childish grappling with faith, and it's a very hard question to answer.
I think it's really important that we grapple with the things that bother us and we don't pretend that they don't bother us. When we pretend that the things that do bother us don't bother us for whatever reason, we're not actually we're not actually engaging with that thing from the heart. So I think it's crucial that we do that. And I would agree. Well, first of all, I would say that the problem of evil needs to be distinguished between the philosophical problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil, right? So it might be the case that the argument for atheism based on evil doesn't work ultimately. Okay, that might be the case. Now, I think I'll show why that is the case in a moment. But that doesn't mean that evil isn't deeply terrible and traumatizing and awful and we want it to go away. And so if I'm talking with somebody who, my friend recently just lost his wife to cancer last
Oh,
week, if
yeah.
I was to sit down and give him a syllogism and explain why God's omnibenevolence doesn't exclude the possibility of evil, that would be a stupid thing to do. You know, when people are in deep and desperate suffering, what they need isn't Christian apologetics. They need someone to come alongside with them and be compassionate to them. That is to say, suffer with. That's what the word compassion means. We need to suffer with our friends and be Christ to them. Okay. But what about this philosophical problem? How might one lay it out in a syllogism? Certain atheistic philosophers, such as the Australian philosopher J.L. Mackie and others, have done this. They've formulated an argument sort of like this: if God is all powerful, he could do away with all evil. If he were all knowing, he couldn't claim to be ignorant of some of the evil in the world. He would know about all of it. And if he were all loving, he would want to do away with all of the evil in the world, which he's capable of doing away with and which he knows all about. The fact that there is evil, though, would seem to prove that God is either impotent, ignorant, or wicked. So either try to cling to that God if you want, or just confess that you were wrong and that God doesn't exist. Um, and before I respond to that, it's interesting in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas, what he often does in his works is he'll present a dozen or sometimes two in different works of his arguments against the position he wants to make. What's really fascinating is when it comes to arguments against God's existence, he can only think of two. One of them is it's superfluous. You know, maybe this whole thing came about because of different reasons that we now know about, and we don't need to posit a God. The second is the problem of evil. Well, the
Yeah.
first, the superfluity of God, doesn't end up being an argument at all, because just because something is superfluous doesn't mean it's false. Maybe we don't have any good reasons to think God exists, but he still does. But the problem of evil, I think, is the strongest argument against God's existence. Well, there was this Calvinist philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga who made some real progress in this area of Christian philosophy or philosophy in general. He said, okay, take Mackie's argument and just insert a fourth premise, right? And here it is. Maybe God has morally permissible reasons for permitting evil and suffering in the world. All right. Now, you don't have to like that premise. You don't have to think it plausible, so long as it is even possible that this God may have reasons for permitting evil and suffering in the world, then it follows that therefore God does not exist, or therefore God is either impotent, wicked, or what have you, doesn't follow at all. So the argument doesn't work.
Lay that
And
out.
then you,
Why? Why does that? Why is that the case?
yeah. So if I say, if God is all powerful, he could do away with all evil. If
Yep.
he's all loving, he would want to. If he's all knowing, he would want to. He could do away with it. Okay, fourth premise. Yeah, but maybe there's good reasons that God permits evil and suffering. I mean, what the hell do you know? The difference between you and God is greater than the difference between a sparrow's brain and trying to understand Wi-Fi. So maybe it's possible. And even if we don't know the reasons, uh, if it's possible, it shows that the argument isn't airtight. So, sure, it might still be the case that atheism is true, but this argument doesn't show that to be the case if it's possible that God would have morally sufficient reasons. And at that point, it throws the burden of proof back on the atheist to show that God doesn't have morally sufficient reason for permitting evil. But I'm not sure how one would do that. Here would be a couple of just, I don't know, ideas off the top of my head as to why God might permit evil. All right. So we talk about God being all powerful, and we say if he's all powerful, he could do away with all evil. Um, but to be all powerful doesn't mean to be able to do what is to do nonsense. You know, if I say, can God create a square circle? The answer is no. And it's not because God is impotent, it's because a square circle doesn't mean anything. If I say, can God create a married bachelor? The answer is no. And again, it's because it's meaningless. Just because I ask a sentence beginning with "can God," it doesn't follow that the sentence will be meaningful. And so, if God has given creatures free will and wishes them to have free will, then to say, well, God should be able to do away with all evil, well, not necessarily, not unless he restricts their free will. I mean, that's so the two have to work in harmony. That's at least one possibility. You don't have to like it. Again, you don't even have to feel convinced by it, but you can see that, okay, fair enough. That's maybe one way around it. Or if you say, God is all knowing, so he knows about all evil. It's like, okay, yeah, since God is all knowing, maybe there are maybe evil does something to us that's beneficial. It's not that God wills there to be evil, but there might be positive consequences that result from us enduring terrible hardships. I've seen this in my own life. A lot of people have seen it in theirs. When they're hit with something, it was like C.S. Lewis. He says, God speaks to us in our pleasures, but shouts to us in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a sleeping world. How many people are out there who would say, it wasn't until I hit freaking rock bottom or till my wife
Yeah.
left me or what have you, that I was able to wake up from this daze I was in and to start taking my life more seriously. Again, that isn't an answer for every uh, person. Some people would just sort of dig their heels in deeper, but it isn't an answer for some. And then to say, well, if he was all loving. Now, this is interesting, right? Because I think it betrays something. I think many of us have a sort of Disneyfied view of God. Paraphrase Dr. William Lane Craig, we basically think that we are God's pets, and it's God's job to create a comfortable little habitat for his human
So
pets.
he can
And
pet us. So he can just, oh, I love you. I love like we pet our puppy dogs.
yeah, or so that we can flourish in the way that we wish to. But what if that's not at all God's desire? What if God's desire is to bring free beings into a free relationship with him so as to find salvation? And it doesn't seem implausible to me that to think that only in a world suffused with this level of suffering would the maximum number of people come to accept this salvation. So again, look, if my wife dies tonight, I'm not interested in listening to this argument. In fact,
Yeah.
it would make me angry. I'd tell you to go somewhere. Um, but that's why I say we do need to make that distinction, because I think, look, when I think about the level of horrific suffering taking place just in my own city, I presume there's prostitution and sex trafficking, fathers beating their children. Like, if
Yeah.
I was to really reflect on that, I would find it hard to believe in God. Yes. But the question isn't, um, the, the, the question is, what should make me lose faith in God? And it's not how I feel. It's really has to be arguments. It has to be led by our rational intellect, not our emotional response to things.
You know, one of the things that um has helped me try to grapple with God, wrestle with God, if you will, is that there's something about the very fact that this has been transmitted as a father-son relationship, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. But that the notion of God the Father, and as a dad, I mean, this is Dad Saves America. I know you're a dad.
Yeah.
Um, when you think about what it means to love your children, it gives us at least an analogous answer to this question, because we know that there are things that will hurt our kids, that if we protect them from them, they won't develop and mature into functional adults. I mean, you know, we had the, I started this channel partly in response to what I was seeing, in my son's life, with his peers. And a lot of it rhymes with Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. The sense in which this sort of emotional and psychological fragility that has come with protecting our kids from suffering, from challenges, from hurty words. If you don't learn sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never kill me or hurt me, then they actually feel like they're going to kill you. And this anti-fragility seems to be part of the kind of creature that we are. And that at least says something about the essence of life and why it doesn't really answer the question, why would God create a creature such as we are, that suffering seems so essential to our learning that, oh, you can tell me don't touch the hot stove, but it's not until I burn myself that I really get it, this embodiedness of life. But it's definitely true. It's definitely true that experiencing hardship, having your heart broken, going through these things, you don't have a full life without it. You don't even know what it means to be happy and fully without knowing what it means to be miserable. And I think that might be an access point that's easily forgotten, in our own lives, right? I mean, how do you think about it as a father? How do you connect to your faith through your own fatherhood?
Yeah, I think that is a nice introduction into this topic. Yeah, I think more broadly, part of the secret of life is learning to live with unanswered questions as well. Now, that doesn't mean leave your brain at the door and don't respond to arguments that are formidable and sound. But it is to say that no matter what worldview you choose to adopt, there are going to be things that you wish could be explained better. You're going to wish that there were things that were clearer. If I choose to be an atheist tomorrow, then it's going to be really difficult for me to explain Big Bang cosmology, that apparently all time, matter, and space came from nothing, or why it seems to be contingent here and now on what an endless chain of causes, but there is no first cause, or the fine tuning of the universe. That's kind of awkward for me as an atheist, or the fact that there seems to be objective moral facts that have no basis in reality. If morals have we've just evolved to act in a certain way for the good of human flourishing, and we've just affixed labels like good and bad and virtue and vice upon society to make people get along, that's awkward for me as well. And so I guess I would just say to the Christian who's struggling with this, it's perfectly reasonable, I think, to say, okay, I don't know how to answer it, but I think I've got good reasons to think that God exists anyway. And I don't think I need to have a response to every argument against what I believe if I've got many good reasons to think that thing is true. Now, if it bothers you, then I think you should. It's quite intellectually exhilarating to pursue something that is bothering you, to really look into the literature, to understand the arguments for and against, and to go, yeah, no, I've settled that in my own mind. And I would certainly encourage people to do that if they felt the need. But I guess what I'm just saying is if people watch this and are like, yeah, I guess I don't have a good reason. It's like, yeah, well, you choose any worldview and you're going to run up against the limits of your intellect. As far as being a father, just just love my kids. They're so funny and cool and delightful. And I suppose it helps me believe in God's love for me even more, because if my kids doubted my love for them, it would break my heart. If I had to kind of convince them of it, it would break my heart. I remember I had once this situation where one of my children was stealing from me. They were quite young, and I could tell something was up, and so I laid on the
Yeah.
bed with this child. I'm like, buddy, what's going on? What's going on? And eventually it poured out with just tremendous pain and passion that he'd been stealing. And I just got to hold him. Like, I love you so much. And there is nothing you can do about that. Uh, you know, uh, Nothing bad you do will ever make me love you less, ever. Not possible. And we had this, and then of course it was like, don't do that again. But
Yeah.
thank you for being honest with me. I love you so much. Right. And so I don't know, like there's times that I struggle to believe in the Father's personal love for me. I can agree with the theological generalization that God loves everyone, but that's a very different truth to, oh, God likes me. He's intimately associated with me. He knows the number of hairs on my head. I don't know what to do with that. That's overwhelming. I feel like such a wretch. I'm so aware of my own poverty. I see the ways that I'm rude with my wife, or that I'm snippy with my kids, or that I obsess over myself, my self-love, my arrogance. I'm so aware of that. And so sometimes it is hard to believe that God could possibly love me. So I guess to answer your question, like when I see the ways I love my kids, it's like, oh, okay, wow.
Yeah.
So the father who's infinitely better than me must really like me, which is cool because I don't often like myself.
the there is this recurrent theme throughout the Bible, right? Of the sacrificing your son. Uh, Jacob, Abraham. and then God himself with Jesus. What do you make of that? It,
Well,
it's
I
it's
think,
it's it is
yeah.
like it is the call for the greatest sacrifice like we can imagine. I would, I think as a father, I would sooner throw myself over off a building than have anything happen like than do that.
Yeah.
So what is this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the sacrifice, or the Abraham sacrificing his son, um, there are, I guess, the basic understanding from a Christian point of view is that God writes history, which is why we call it his story, and so history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And when you look at the sacrifice that God asked Abraham to make, we see an analogy to God asking, well, for Christ choosing to sacrifice himself. So we have the two of them walking up a mountain in the same hill country, actually, as where Christ was crucified. We see the young man, Isaac, carrying wood
Hmm.
up the mountain. And then we see that it would appear that Abraham, from the beginning, knew that God was going to intervene, because he says to Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb, right? Because Isaac says, here is the wood, here is the fire, but where's the lamb? He says, God himself will uh, provide the lamb. I think the understanding we could possibly draw from that, so I don't think it's the only one, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you could say, okay, well, Abraham believed in the faithfulness of God the whole way through. And what we find is not actually a lamb, but we see a goat in the thickets. And when John the Baptist points at Christ and says, behold, the Lamb of God, here we have the true Son of the Father who would sacrifice himself for our salvation. I don't know if that helps.
I think one of the things that maybe is a there's so many sticking points for so many people, right? But I think the notion that there was this original sin
Mm-hmm.
that 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 the Son of God must go down to hell to unlock or unleash or cleanse for all mankind, and that there was a period where that wasn't done. That what that all the people that came up until that point somehow were trapped, and then um, and then finally, right around 2,000 years ago, God's Son is delivered and opens this gate. Um, help the person that's either that's heard that or does or grapples with original sin or says original sin just sounds bizarre. How do
Yeah.
you think about original sin? Because it also feels very tied to the whole story, the whole picture.
Yeah. So my understanding is that original sin is less like a positive thing that we acquire and more like a deprivation. So it would be like if your parents were quite well off and you were expecting your inheritance at some point and they went and blew it at Vegas. Then they had nothing to hand down to you. And so there's a deprivation there. And so I think that's the Catholic Church's understanding that our original parents were created in a state of grace, and their lower appetites were always in conformity with their reason. But their choosing to reject God somehow messed this up.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as the descendants of Adam and Eve, we get we don't get what we should have got. That's, I think, the basic understanding of original sin. What was the first thing you had said?
Well,
Sorry.
it's just that there's this sort of completion of that story arc in on Easter Sunday, right? That's
Yeah.
when I think when and you can pardon how
Oh,
low
sorry.
resolution some of this is for me, but when like Christians talk about salvation, that is part of it,
Hmm.
is it not?
Yeah. I wanted to say something before then that you brought up that I thought was a really good point. Adam and Eve say, oh, yeah. So it's not the Catholic teaching, and you may not have been alluding to this, but just in case there was some misunderstanding, it's not Catholic teaching that everybody who died prior to Christ is in hell. The understanding of Christ actually going down into Hades is not the hell of the damned that he went down to, but Abraham's bosom and the place of the dead where the faithful souls awaited salvation. And so It's an understanding in Catholic theology that Adam and Eve are saved, which is wild, actually. You know that the people who started this whole mess would be saved. You know, Elijah and Moses; these people are saints in heaven. I mean, we see in Matthew 17 Moses and Elijah appearing with Christ. So, just in case there was some confusion there, and then the understanding, simply put, because I'm a simple man, so it helps me, of Christ's life, death, and resurrection is that he paid a debt he didn't owe because we owed a debt we couldn't pay, which might sound cute, but I think it's helpful that by Christ's life, death, and resurrection, he has redeemed the world. And now that redemption gets to be applied to us so that we can be saved, so that we can have faith, hope, and charity and be in right relationship with God. So if original sin has alienated us from God in a real sense, then being incorporated into his body, the church, through baptism, is what sort of restores that union. And now the restoration of that friendship we now have with God doesn't mean we don't struggle or feel the effects of original sin. We do, but that we can trust that God will give us the grace to heal from those wounds, grow in sanctification. And if we die, but are still, you know, if we die in God's friendship, which is just to say we haven't rejected the salvation he won for us, then this is why Catholics talk about purgatory, which is essentially the final rush of one's sanctification. Like we all understand when we come into a relationship with Christ, we're still dealing with baggage and wounds and memories of sins we committed that we feel gross about. We still feel an inclination to those sins that we spent a lifetime doing and we wish we didn't, but we find that we do. And we understand that in heaven, we're not going to be dealing with that. We're not going to be dealing with that junk. That if it's not purified in this life and we die in God's friendship, it will be purified at some point. And that is basically the Catholic understanding of purgatory.
Last last school year, let's say, because we're sitting here, it's April. My son and I went through the adult rite RCIA, and that's
Oh,
because
cool.
he hadn't, you know, he was baptized actually by my senior year theology teacher, Father Krivak. Um, but because of for a whole host of reasons, he didn't end up going to Catholic school until his senior year of high school, and we were sort of coming up to the end of this period where he's in high school and he's with us and he's not off to college or whatever. And I said, okay, Mateo, here's the deal. We got to complete the promise I made. I promised that I was going to raise you to be a Catholic, and you're not fully Catholic. So you can choose to be Catholic or not. Ultimately, that's up to you. But we're going to go through this together. And he it was an awesome experience, partly just for the time we spent together, because I went to all the classes with him. Um, but it also was like getting soaked in this very entry level re-engagement with all these questions. And this question of hell was an interesting one because the deacon in that particular class, you know, my son asks like, well, what does the church say? Is Hitler in hell? Who's in hell? And the way the deacon said it was, well, the church actually doesn't say that anyone is necessarily in hell. The church doesn't proclaim to know exactly what happens next. Which as a skeptical philosophical 18-year-old, he really liked. Because the idea that, oh no, we know exactly, here's who's in heaven, here's who's in purgatory, here's who's in hell, rubbed him the wrong way, and I think understandably so. You know, when you think about the authority in things like this, as a Catholic, that the church, that the Pope, that the whole hierarchy sort of brings to bear on these questions, like where's the hardest part for you? Like, where do you turn towards sort of like, well, this is what the church says, and
Hmm.
say, ah, like it's like discomforting. Like that doesn't feel like enough. That feels like just an appeal to authority, and I don't know about that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Um, so I think it was Anselm who, maybe I have that wrong, talking about faith seeking understanding. So God's word is perfect and completely trustworthy because it comes from God. But that doesn't mean, so I can accept it, but it doesn't mean I will understand it. And it doesn't mean I don't have questions about it. John Henry Newman said something to the effect of 1,000 questions don't add up to one doubt. So questions are good. So if something's bothering me, like, okay, like eternal conscious torment, you're telling me that God sends people to hell for all eternity, and you want me just to accept that. I don't know how to accept that. So fair enough. Ask questions, read the scriptures. So yeah, I find hell hard to accept. I think it was, again, this is the third time I've quoted him. C.S. Lewis said that if there was one doctrine he could do away with, it would be hell. He
Yeah.
would like to believe that there isn't a hell. Fair enough. I mean, I think most Christians get that. But he says it has the full weight of scripture and tradition behind it. And so he accepts it, and I accept it as well. The idea that people can exclude themselves from God's friendship is a real terrifying possibility, and it's a possibility that could be an outcome for any one of us. And so the church teaches that once we're brought into a relationship with Christ, like we've been saved, and he continues to save us. But just because he's saving us, it doesn't mean we can't apostatize or just sort of flip him the bird, as it were, by committing some horrendous evil and rejecting him through that particular action. And so the church teaches that if we knowingly and willingly reject him in a serious way, and we die in that state, we will be damned forever. So yeah, I accept it. I just think yes, and I do. I absolutely accept it on authority. I think Thomas Aquinas said that the argument from authority is the weakest argument, except for when God is the authority. And so all of us place, uh, all of us sort of try to submit to some authority or multiple authorities, even if that authority is ourself. And so it seems to me that I'd probably be doing a much wiser thing to submit to the church, to the teachings of Christ, right? Who said the narrowest path is the path is narrow, which leads to life, and only if you find it. The path is broad and leads to destruction, and many people are going that way. When you take that into account, and many other verses, or you take in private revelation accounts where saints have seen hell, which of course is not on the same level as scripture, but it's not nothing, it seems to me, especially when the church says it's worthy of belief. So then I go, yeah, okay, then I submit to the authority of the church. And that's actually really nice. Because if I'm not going to do that, now that isn't to say believe things you know are false. That's not what I'm saying. Because I think that the church's teachings are never against reason, and we can show why they're reasonable. So I think people are right to try to go, okay, how is this reasonable? I think that's perfectly valid. But if I'm not going to submit to the church Christ established and gave authority to, I'm going to submit to some authority, whether that's myself or some YouTuber or Martin Luther or someone else. And I think I've got good reason to submit to the church. And so I'm going to just do that. And that actually takes a lot of exhaustion out of this work. I mean, imagine if you had to go over 2,000 years of Christian history and writings just to get your theology straight. Wouldn't have it made a lot more sense if God had have just established a church and gave that church teaching authority so that we didn't have to be all brilliant historians and theologians to figure all this out? Well, it turns out he did, I think.
This is one of these elements of our times that I think is so, there's so many cross currents when it comes to authority, right? So here we sit in 2025, 5 years after the world was smashed by a virus, a pandemic that also smashed all of the institutions of public health and public science, who just a few months from now, 5 years ago, would be telling us you must stay in your home unless you're out in the streets protesting. Then suddenly the virus doesn't see you anymore. I think a friend of mine, Martin Gurry, has a book called The Revolt of the Public that talks about this, that we are in an age a
Mm.
lot like the age of Martin Luther in the aftermath of the printing press. We are in a kind of new printing press age with the internet, starting really in the 2000s, not just social media, but the internet writ large, that has put
Hmm.
authority in an acid bath. that authority itself has almost never been a dirtier word. And so how do you think about, because at the same time that that's happening, that we don't trust we don't trust credentials, we don't trust universities for good reason, we don't trust politicians for good reason. Science with the TM attached has taken a beating for good reason. There also seems to be at least a little upswing in Christendom. There's something like a little mini revival. Maybe it's a blip on a downward slope. But how do you think about those forces that are at work right now culturally?
First of all, I agree with your assessment of things. I never got the jab, but I kind of think that if the government demanded that I not do it, I would have done it. And I think there's something kind of like cool. And I'm not American, but this is partly why I like Americans.
Yeah.
I was in Australia recently, and it just feels like every news outlet is singing from the same sheet of paper. And if you kind of press against the mainstream narrative, they know how to quickly isolate you and make you seem like a loony. And so I love living in this wild, crazy country because you seem to have like competing voices, at least, that are either putting forth some narrative or contradicting. I do like that. But I think the only reason not to listen to an authority is because either they're not an authority or they are an authority but don't have your interest in mind. But I think when it comes to God, he is an authority and he does have our best interest in mind. And so for that reason, we can accept it. Now, just like it would be, I think it would be wrong to accept something that was nonsense. I mean, I don't know, like just to use an example that could get us in hot water, but just this idea that if you got the jab, like that was it. Like you'll never, ever, under any circumstances, get COVID. And I had family in Australia who were like talking to me like I was literally maybe not abusing maybe abusing my children, yeah, through neglect. And they never got the jab. And I remember saying to my family member, "Isn't this the third time you've had COVID? Didn't you say like?" And they went, "Yes, but I'd be in a much worse place without it." And it's like, so that's the narrative bought into. So we got to go along with this. Yeah, but I don't know. I think that I don't think God and the church are. So my point was simply, you shouldn't believe something that's nonsensical, and there's no virtue in believing that squares can be circular. There's no virtue in that if you know what squares and circular mean. But when it comes to the truths revealed to us by God through the church, I don't think they're like that. I think there are things that supersede our reason, like God is three persons, or that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. But I don't think that any truths taught to us by the church contradict reason, ever, under any circumstances. If there is a truth taught by the church that contradicts, say, legitimate science, you've either got a faulty understanding of revelation or bad science, because there's only one truth and truth can't contradict truth. So I guess I would say to the skeptical person out there, like, okay, fair enough. Like I understand that we've got lots of reasons to be skeptical today, but every single one of us puts confidence in some authority, even if it's multiple authorities, or you jump on the bandwagon of this political podcaster, and yeah, this guy, and then you start to doubt him a little bit. And there's someone over there that's attacking him. And so, yeah, no, he's the real enlightened soul.
Yeah.
I mean, even our own intellect, like we put trust in that. We put trust in our ability to assess arguments and come to conclusions. And then we put stock and authority in our memory, which just remembers, oh, at one point I made that argument and I found that sound, even if we don't go back and examine the steps of that argument. So we're all putting faith in authority. The question is,
that's a really interesting thought. I hadn't really thought about this, the sense in which we put faith in our own prior thinking, and it's
that's
sort
wild.
of like that.
Why think that?
Yeah, it's like,
why
oh
think
wait,
that's reasonable.
Wait, why do I believe that?
And what's crazy, I don't know if you ever thought about this. Like if you and I had a couple of beers, we'd have this conversation. What's crazy is if you imagine in something. So just imagine this morning, whatever you were doing this morning, and your best friend walked into the house and said hi. Even if that didn't happen, you imagine that happening, all right? And then he walks out. Okay. that is phenomenologically almost identical to any actual memory I've had. So how do I know I can trust my memories at all? And I don't worry, I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying I am really interested in epistemology and why it is we believe anything that we believe. Because I think we've got far too high a standard of those things that we should accept. We have this Cartesian idea that's been born out from Rene Descartes and modern epistemologists that unless I can have certainty in something, then I shouldn't believe it. But I'm not certain of anything in that sense. I'm not certain that I exist. I'm not certain that my wife's name is Cameron. I'm not certain that I'm in America. If by certainty you mean that sort of Cartesian, indubitable, incorrigible certainty. So I think it's a standard that's far too high. So I think the solution to Cartesian epistemology is phenomenal conservatism. All right. So Cartesian epistemology says, unless you're certain, you don't have good reason to accept something. Phenomenal conservatism says, if something appears to me to be the case, then I'm within my epistemological rights to go on believing that thing unless I have good reason to deny it. I don't know if that interests you, but
It
I've been
does.
thinking about that a lot lately.
Well, it it dovetails into something that I really wanted to dive in together with, which is sort of at the root of your show. You know, Thomas Aquinas. Uh, Thomas Aquinas. My son actually picked Thomas as his confirmation name uh, because he's philosophical, and Aquinas occupies a role not just in like the Catholic and Christian tradition, but also in the Western tradition of philosophy, at the intersection of reason and faith and the limits of both.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's been something at the like the most simpleton type of arguments that have happened over my lifetime and overall all of time, right, has been faith versus reason, science versus religion. Oh, what about the church versus Galileo? And for most people, you hear these things, and that is like the level of resolution of the kind of discourse. Like, oh, well, I'm scientific, so therefore I don't know about this God stuff. And then you just like scratch the surface of the history of the West, and you discover people like Thomas Aquinas and facts like basically all of the universities of the West were founded by the church.
Mm-hmm.
So how anti-reason could the church be if it founded like all the universities, especially in Europe, save for I think the one that Marx came out of. I think that was one of the not Catholic church. Somebody told me recently, like, oh, you know what? You want to see a university that wasn't founded by the church, the one that Marx came out of. But so lay out for me and for the audience the role as you understand it of Thomas Aquinas in this battle of ideas, but at where faith and reason collide or come and run side by side with each other.
So Aquinas' basic point, if I could put it in my own words, is that faith is to reason what a telescope is to the natural eye. So the telescope doesn't cancel the natural eye. It doesn't make it redundant or unnecessary. And so too, faith doesn't do that with reason. Reason can get us really far. Aquinas doesn't think you need faith to believe that God exists. He thinks that you can come to believe that God exists solely through philosophical reasoning. He also thinks that you can come to believe that this God is all powerful, that he's one, that he isn't a body, that he's all knowing, and things like this. And if people are interested in that, I would encourage them to check out the Summa Theologiae, the first part of the Summa Theologiae, question 1, and then article 1 and 2. There's also an excellent online course taught by some Dominican friends of mine called Aquinas101.com,
Yep.
where you can watch free courses from really brilliant Dominicans who go over the Summa. So I guess that's what I would say. I don't want to repeat myself from earlier, but just to say the church does not teach that faith can contradict reason, but it does teach that faith can see further than reason can, which doesn't make reason unnecessary. It's just to say, well, there are things that you don't have access to, which God reveals to you. and so back to what he said about God's existence, when he says that we can come to believe God exists wholly apart from revelation, he says that is, even though that's true, he says three awkward consequences would result. One, people would come to believe in God only after a long time because, you need to be smart enough to deal with metaphysical arguments and you need to study philosophy. And then I think he says not everyone would even if not everyone would be able to do that because they've got lives to live and like children to feed. They don't have the time.
Yeah.
And then even if they had the time and they were able to do the study, what they would come to would be maybe a basically true belief, but with a lot of errors associated with it. And so for this reason, God has revealed himself to man in a way that we can give assent to. So, yeah.
One of the things that I find interesting and challenging is the timing. To stay tethered to this Holy Week, it's almost exactly 2,000 years ago, give or take a couple years, right? That we believe that Jesus of Nazareth is crucified and resurrects 3 days later. How do you understand why it would be 2,000 years ago instead of, say, today?
Why did Christ not appear today?
Yeah, or like why might that moment in time for humans on this planet have been the right time for that to happen? Because that's kind of a big question. It can't be random. I've heard some arguments for why. I mean, one reason why I would not be super pumped for it to happen today is it's not clear anyone would believe anything that happened today. It's like, well, that's just some AI video, right? It's like, I've seen there's all these unbelievable, miraculous things that no one understands that I didn't know about until 5 minutes ago. Like all these appearances of the Blessed Mother, Mary. There was one in Egypt in the 1960s where she lit, and there's photos of it, of this like apparition in the sky in Egypt in the 1960s, seen by tens of thousands of people, most of whom were Muslim, many of whom were secular and scientists and journalists, and they're taking photographs of it.
Yeah.
Those same
think of Fatima and the miracle of the sun, and the atheistic authorities acknowledging what they saw, or the many miracles associated with Lourdes, or the tilma of Juan Diego, upon which is Our Lady of Guadalupe, that should have deteriorated by now, but hasn't. Yeah, I think there are a lot of good reasons that people could look into of miracles that are taking place today, that even if you're skeptical and you want to be like, okay, that's bullcrap. I mean, there's a lot of weird things people say. I don't have time to deal with this. It's like, yeah, well, actually, there's some really good, yeah, sure. Some reported miracles are bullcrap. That's obviously true. Maybe most of
Jesus
them.
on
Maybe
toast.
most of them.
Jesus'
exactly.
face on toast.
yeah, but that doesn't mean they all are, and so they're worth looking into. Sometimes I hear people say, and maybe this is to your original question, that why should I believe something, like from 2,000 years ago? Like that just seems not wise or something. But the gap between when the New Testament was written and now really isn't what matters. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence because of the unfolding of many years or hundreds of years. Really, the question is, do we have any good reason to think that the New Testament is reliable, that it was written by eyewitnesses or associates of the eyewitnesses, and within a reasonable amount of time from the events to when they took place? And I'm not an expert on this. I can't just spit out the numbers to you like I wish that I could. But I'm really, I find it completely compelling. Like if you read the works of Dr. Brant Petra or others, it's like, yeah, no, these were clearly written by eyewitnesses and within a short amount of time from the events. And so that data, that evidence that we have doesn't become bad evidence just because it was 2,000 years ago.
And to the timing question, have you thought much about like why it
Not
would be
really.
then instead of some other time?
No, I remember Dr. William Lane Craig giving a really good answer to Christopher Hitchens in that famous debate he did back in the day. And I'd point people to that because Christopher Hitchens got an absolute hiding. I remember being terrified to watch that debate because I just could not watch another Christian get shellacked by Christopher Hitchens. And it was remarkably good news, to me anyway, that William Lane Craig absolutely decimated him. One of the points he brought up was this one you're bringing up right now, where he gave some reason why it made sense for Christ to become incarnate around that time, but I forget exactly the details of that.
It's an interesting
Yeah,
question to ask, partly, and one I've seen some
I mean
videos along these
the
lines,
fact that
but yeah,
the fact that Christianity spread so far and wide within so short amount of time, like that's undeniable. Like
yeah,
this is what the Jesus mythicists have a difficult time responding to. It's like, how the heck do you like come up with this figure who did these things, have his disciples either die or be willing to die? I mean, tradition says that all of them but St. John were martyred. Maybe we don't have good evidence for all of that. We've certainly got good evidence to think that Paul was beheaded, that Peter was crucified upside down. But like people don't willingly die for something they think is false. Now, people do willingly die for false things. Think
yeah,
of the Islamicists, but but they think that what they're dying for is true. Do you
right,
know what I mean?
yeah.
And so I think that so the fact that Christianity spread so far and wide and powerfully, I think should make us go, okay, wow. So therefore, there must have been a good reason Christ came then. Otherwise, it wouldn't have spread like that. What are those reasons? And I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think one I do wonder in this time we're in now if it literally was because it was a moment where simultaneously you had the Roman Empire and enough of a travel and communication to spread a message, but you weren't living in the TikTok era where message spreading would be just lost. It would just be lost in the noise and the chaos of everything else, and it was like you needed like a just the right amount of normal skepticism and cynicism to have it be possible for people to take something seriously that's that fantastic.
Yeah, these are I really mean this. These are really fun things to think about, but it's hard to imagine what our society would look like today if Christ had never have become incarnate. Who the hell knows what we would look like at this point in history? So, not sure.
One of the um one of the things I was watching a video from Jordan Peterson, who I know you've had on the show, and he was speaking to a friend of mine that's a professor at the University of Austin here, and he made the claim that I am inclined to take seriously that the Enlightenment is over, or at least that the age of reason and reason as the only thing we need, which might be a straw man way to propose what the Enlightenment was, but that has come to an end or it has reached its sort of its limit. And I find myself as feeling that. I think that there's something about where we
Hmm.
are in this moment in time, the sort of corrosive force of this postmodern philosophy, the sort of there is no truth, there's only my truth, there's only power and outcomes. That all feels like it almost in a way it's liberalism in a certain sense. It starts with, you could say, thinking like John Stuart Mill, utilitarian type of thinking. That's kind of materialistic and says, okay, well, we just want human flourishing. And how do we get that? Well, whatever promotes human flourishing is good. And so you have this sort of ends justify the means seed planted there. And you get to
Yeah.
this modern moment we're in where that has completely, the wheels have come off that bus. How do you think about that? How do you think about, because Aquinas is a figure of the Enlightenment in a very real sense, or he is part of the architecture of that history, of Western civilizational history. Where do you think we are now in that sweep?
Yeah. I'm not. too familiar with the history of the Enlightenment, but if I take it to mean a sort of ascendancy of reason
Yeah.
over and above the proposed truths of the Catholic Church, and look how rational we'll all become. Yeah, I think that doesn't seem to have worked. We have the French Revolution, two world wars, the Holocaust, all sorts of things resulted from throwing off God, you could argue. Um, in the Second Vatican Council, the church or the Synod Fathers say, when God is forgotten, the creature itself becomes unintelligible. That is to say, if we don't know who God is and why he created us, we will cease to understand what we even are. And so I think we've seen this dramatically over the last 20 years, where we were assured again by the new atheists that if we would just throw off this old superstitious Christianity, there would be an ascendance of morality and reason and flourishing. And then, oh, wait, men can now have babies. And if you don't agree with that, it's because you are a hateful bigot. So I think this, to your earlier point, is partly why we are seeing either a resurgence of Christianity or, as you say, a blip on a downward trajectory. Is that I think we kind of woke up the way a man might wake up after a hangover or after being drunk, and he wakes up in a friggin' dumpster behind some apartment or whatever, and he's like, "What the? I gotta change my life."
Yeah. It's
And
like
so I
that.
think there are
It's that
you go.
moment in that it's become a meme, and it's wonderful, where Bradley Cooper is out in the desert from Hangover, and he's like,
Ah,
"We effed up," He's like,
what did he say?
he's
Oh,
like,
we
"We
effed
effed
up.
up,"
Oh
and he's
yeah.
on the phone. It's like this class. It's such a great
Yes, that's
comic
good.
beat.
I haven't seen that, but that's a
um,
great. Yeah, and so I think what we're seeing now is the political left maybe kind of gravitating towards the political right. As this is happening, we're seeing large tent conservatism like knock out its walls and grow larger. Whether that's good or not, we'll see. Probably not, but who knows? And so there are more people coming in, right, to the more politically conservative tent. And I think within now this broad conservatism movement in the United States, you're seeing a new look at Christianity. I think there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think the new atheists, while they, were kind of charming sometimes and did a good job making Christians look silly, they didn't ever kind of propose a sort of a unified, coherent worldview. They could just tell you what they were against, but they couldn't actually propose anything for us all to get on board with. I think you also have gateway drugs into Christianity, like Dr. Jordan Peterson, who, just sort of said, maybe shut up and stop laughing at Christianity because you have no freaking idea what you're talking about. And because he wasn't explicit in his religious faith, I think it gave people the freedom to sort of explore biblical ideas, develop a new respect for it, and I think that's been part of it. And then I think within this broader Christian resurgence, we're seeing another look at apostolic versions of Christianity, like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, etc.
the One of the things that I encountered is very Aquinas in a sense, and I sort of tripped over this, and I don't see it talked about as much as I would expect, especially with like your work and like Wes Huff going on Joe Rogan and talking about the Bible, sort of these like apologetic things that are breaking out of that world. Um, and that is, there's this mathematician named Kurt Gödel or Gödel. Are you familiar with his work, his arguments?
The mathematician, I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with his arguments at all. No.
So it's really interesting to me. I'll lay it out a little bit, and maybe
Yeah.
it can just be something for a further conversation down the road. But so I first heard about this because I was literally watching it. He was referenced almost offhandedly in a speech by George Gilder about his book Life After Google.
Hmm.
And to some extent, I think he was talking about the limits of this sort of hyper rationalism. This like, oh, we can AI our way to everything. We can solve through math. all of the mysteries. There's any kind of God is just the God of the gaps. And Gödel it's G-O with an umlaut, D-E-L. He created this unprovable proof that basically goes something like this. And I brought it with me because I was like, I want to make sure I get this right because I thought you'd find it interesting. So he basically was able to he could translate statements into arithmetic. And so in math, you need to be able to prove the statements. The mathematical proof is how you know that the math is correct, that you didn't make a mistake.
Yeah.
And so he translates this statement into arithmetic, and the statement goes something like this: this statement cannot be proven in this system. And so I'm going to read sort of a summary real quick because it's hard. It's hard for me to even grapple with this. But basically, why is this a challenge? Well, if it could be proven, the system would be inconsistent because a false statement would be provable. So it's sort of self-contradictory. If it can't be proven, then the statement's true that it's unprovable, but that also means the system of math is incomplete. And so this is this notion of the incompleteness theorem and the sort of expansion of this. This is a very low resolution way to think about this, but I think it's right. And as I've tried to grapple with this and find people making use of it, it doesn't seem like I'm completely off my rocker. There is no such thing as a coherent system that is internally consistent and complete and has everything it needs from within. Every system, every logical system, mathematics itself, if it works, it is incomplete, meaning that there is some set of assumptions that come from without the system that are literally, it's hard to even think how to use words for this, but it is something like there is a creator of it. And that creator has its own rules that aren't in the system, but have built the system. It's this doorway into, you could say, the infinite, because it means you can't, at the level of math, at the level of basic arithmetic, the logic of the universe, the language of the material order, doesn't have everything, all the answers in it. It can't, by definition. And all I can say is like this was a kind of mathematician's crack in the armor of the Enlightenment, because he laid out that the most pure form of reason, mathematics, can't prove itself. It's almost more ironclad a door into the unknown than something like the fine-tuning hypothesis of the universe, I think, perhaps. Which is why I find it kind of strange that I don't encounter it that much. Because anyway, you know, react if you will, but it's something I want. I was kind of hoping we could geek out on, but I think it might be something to extend into another conversation.
Yeah, one of the most difficult things, you know, this about being a content creator is being honest about when you have no idea what is being discussed. I understand what you're saying, but I haven't read it at all, so I wouldn't want to comment on it. See, that's very different to 15 years ago, Matt Fradd, who got embarrassed that he didn't know stuff and then started talking about things he didn't know, and then it became apparent to everybody but him very immediately.
Very good, very good.
I would love to have a cigar with you and talk about this. In fact, if you have any videos on this topic, I'd love to look into it myself. The immediate thing that I kind of could reference it to in what I know or what I think about often is the idea of contingent realities versus necessary realities. So Aquinas's first argument for God's existence is an argument for a first cause.
Yes.
Now, it's not a first cause chronologically. He's not saying that it's impossible for there to be an infinite past. He famously disagreed with Bonaventure on this and said God could have created an infinite past. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what his thought was. When he talks about contingent being needing a first cause, he's not talking about it chronologically, but hierarchically. So instead of dominoes, think links on a chandelier, right? So everything we encounter is contingent upon something else. It doesn't have to exist, but it does exist. And as it exists, it exists because it is contingent upon other realities that keep it in existence. Okay. So, all right, do we stop there? And you're, well, no, not if those things keeping the thing in existence are also contingent. If they're also contingent, then we need to find some other cause. And so originally, so this way of thinking shows that, okay, well, unless there is a first uncaused cause, there couldn't be any contingent reality at all. So God is not just one being among many for Thomas Aquinas, but rather he is the very act of existence. So we have essences and we have existence. Some things have an essence but not existence, like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, perhaps. Some things have neither essence nor existence, like a square circle. We're given existence, but he says that God is the only being whose essence, like what he is existence. So his isness is his thatness, and that makes him fundamentally different to every other being in existence, because where we share an existence, he is existence. And so Aquinas argues for this through philosophy, but he also points back to Exodus chapter 3, where Moses asks for God's name, and God says, I am that I am, or I am. And from that, he draws this same conclusion: I am existence itself. And that, anyway, so what you were saying made me think about that, but I'd like to look into what you said a bit more.
Yeah, that I first encountered that explanation of that moment of like Yahweh, of I am, by Bishop Barron in a conversation, and he laid that out, and the way he put it, which I found really, again, it might be partly because I'm a little bit of a math head. There was a time where I thought I was going to go into computer science, so I like these mathematical types of things, although at this point my math is so atrophied that it's probably fourth grade level.
I can barely do my taxes at a restaurant, my tip at a restaurant. I'm like 15%, 20%, 25%. What are these things? So don't worry. I'm sure you're much better than we're on, Matt.
I'm doing that.
And meanwhile, I'm kind of getting on my kids to, come on, math's really important. And I'm like, I'm really bad at it. But anyway.
Yeah, help dad. Pay no attention to my use of the calculator.
That's right.
But I think he's, an argument, a similar thing to this. They're like, well, what do we mean here? Essence. What are we talking about? It's like, well, one way I've heard described is when you think about what numbers are, they are essential. They are an essence, like the number 2 or any number. It isn't two particular instances of a thing that we count 1, 2. There is the number 2. That is a pure abstraction. It's a pure essence of it's purely the conceptual thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is 2 in our minds, and it exists. There are 2 stars, 2 atoms, 2 cups, 2 iPads. But it isn't any one of those. It's the very notion of there being 2.
And it would exist if all of reality was reduced to one isolated quark, let's say.
Right. There would still be the essence of 2 can't be destroyed, even if all of matter is gone. And that is hard to get your head around. And for nerds like us who want to battle in this philosophical space, I think it's pretty interesting. To come back to this at the edge of reason. What does that mean to you? If we are at a moment in history where the low-hanging fruit of reason and science has been picked, and there's going to be more technological advances and all kinds of things, but we're now at this point where the cost benefit for the human person is getting hard. I mean, AI points to this in a lot of ways. Like, where are we heading with this? A world where nobody works might just be miserable. We have a lot of indication that we like to be needed and have things to do and be purposeful, and we will be miserable. So how do you think about kind of how to navigate this world that we're in? If now it's like, right, well,
here's a couple of ideas.
Yeah.
And none of them are profound. But one is to read good fairy tales to your children. read the good Russian fairy tales, read the Brother Grimm's original fairy tales, and read them to yourself over a glass of whiskey, because I think the fairy tales are truer than any account of the history of America or the West. I think the same with the Lord of the Rings. I think it's a more factual book than a book of quote unquote facts. The world is more strange than we think it is, more strange than we've been led to believe. And I'm sometimes of the opinion that fairy tales are what's going to save civilization, not apologetics. I don't really mean that in an either or sense. Obviously, people need to be engaged in apologetics, and I'm glad that they are. But I think that's one thing is just the importance of fairy tales. I had another one, but it's escaped my mind.
Well, it's very Petersonian of you. It's like
Is
with
it?
truth, what is, grappling with the questions of what's true.
Well, the other thing I was thinking of is in the Brothers Karamazov, in shortly towards the beginning from the beginning, where Father Zosima is talking to the old women, and this woman says that she wants to believe, but she can't. And then, to mix my imagery here, it was Fyodor Dostoevsky who was talking to Alyosha, and he says, "I just don't understand it. Like, does hell have a ceiling? And if it doesn't have a ceiling, then how can it have chains with hooks? The whole system breaks down." And I love that, because these are the sorts of things that we think sometimes. But anyway, this woman wanted to believe, but she just couldn't. And he says something to the effect, I forget exactly, but like, go home and love your family and love people around you. And when you do that, you'll find that it's easier to believe, and that you actually just will believe, which can sound like a cop out to the skeptical mind. But if you're sort of done with skepticism because you've seen where it's led you, a sort of weary pragmatist, then maybe give it up. Maybe give up skepticism entirely and begin to accept again that the world is an enchanted place, that your dreams mean things, and that scientific materialism is false and should be rejected. I just began reading an excellent book by Rod Dreher, and it has to do with enchantment, and it really gets into these issues. I haven't proceeded much beyond the first chapter, but I think those things are really important. I also think that what we're seeing in the absence of Christianity, in addition to the insanity of gender ideology, race ideology, etc., is not a sort of static atheism in the sense of God doesn't exist, but let's get about our business. What we're seeing is a incredible growth in witchcraft
Yeah.
and Satanism. And so I think because of that, people are going to have to choose which God to follow. And I think we are already seeing signs and wonders. I mean, I've had multiple exorcists on my show who look me dead in the eye, unless they're the biggest liars in the world and just really bad people. And I don't think they are. And I don't think they're nuts. And I don't think they're superstitious. Are telling me of just remarkable supernatural events that they encounter on a regular basis, and that more and more people are beginning to encounter. So there's that.
I started a book about, you mentioned Our Lady of Guadalupe, this image of the Blessed Mother that appeared on essentially cactus. I think it was like made of
Yeah.
cactus tilma,
Yep.
this thing
Yep.
that should basically turn into dust within 30 years and still persists and has survived terror bombing attacks. Um, Led to something like 5 million Mexicans converting to Catholicism.
Right.
And this book, it's a short book. The name of the book's escaping me, but it talks about Cortez coming
Hmm.
into the Aztec world and finding this essentially isolated civilization that, by any account, was literally a place run by Satan,
Yes.
where the leaders were sacrificing 80,000
Yes.
plus men and children, women and children a year to the hummingbird god. They had gotten so efficient at removing the beating heart that they could do it within something like 15 seconds. And you would have lines out to the horizon of
Yes.
sacrificial slaves, largely waiting in line to be brutally sacrificed. And in
Yes.
comes Cortez, and this sort of ragtag bunch of Castilians, and at like the young man who would become Juan Diego is alive at this moment and will grow to be the person who has this miracle happen. And so it's like it's a crazy. I'm here in Texas. You know, I was born in the Northeast, so I didn't have exposure to Our Lady of Guadalupe in the same way that since moving down here, we're like, I mean, my son went to San Juan Diego High School for his senior year, so and it's like 88% Mexican descent population. That is that strikes me as profoundly true. That there is and you talk about this spiritual warfare. That's a real thing. That's not mumbo jumbo. But make the case. Make the case for that there is such a thing as spiritual warfare, and how you think we should win it or fight it.
Yeah. Well, my justification for believing in spiritual warfare is based upon the revelation of God in Holy Scripture. So if somebody listening doesn't like that, doesn't want to make that leap, then I can't take them any further of the way. But if you take divine revelation seriously, then what you see is that God exists, that he loves you, that he desires a relationship with you and salvation for you. But there are also beings, devils and demons, that hate you immensely and desire to drag you to hell. And so you might trivialize, not you, but those watching, you may trivialize spiritual warfare, but the earliest Christians didn't at all. I mean, read 1 Peter 5:8. The devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Yeah, stand up to him, firm in the faith. Ephesians 6 talks about the armor of God that we must put on. Christ exercised people and also spoke repeatedly about the fact that we have an enemy. Revelation chapter 12, verses 10 calls Satan the accuser of our brethren, who accuse them day and night before the throne of God. So we live in a world at war. And I'm sorry that everything in your life has led you to think the opposite. That, you know, the water's running, the electricity's on, the streets are neat, the housing looks sort of, we're kind of gaslit into thinking that things are well, but things are not well. Things are terrifyingly terrible. And you have the option of recognizing that fact that you are at war or not. And if you don't, and choose to just kind of live the myth of you grow and you work and you save and you retire and you die, and that's all totally fine, then I don't think your life will make much sense to you. So I think the Christian story is true. And because it's true, it's helpful. And I think when we deny the existence of the demonic, we no longer we don't repent of our sin, because what is sin anyway? And hell doesn't exist. And then the good news offered to us in the gospel isn't that at all. It's actually just no news. You know, good news without bad news is no news, or it's just annoying news. If a firefighter bursts into my house at 5 a.m. and drags his hoses through the house and stomps mud through my carpet, if there's no fire, I'm actually kind of pissed. I'm irritated. What the heck happened? I have a lot of questions. This is so stupid. Who's going to pay for this? But if he comes in and I recognize that my house is burning down, then I thank him immensely. And so that's what we have to realize. You know, if we're in a world at war and you are a wretched sinner deserving of eternal damnation, which you are, then recognizing the offer Christ wants to make to you suddenly becomes like that firefighter who's saving your life. And not until then. And so that's why I think it is important that we recover that sense of our own poverty. In the book of Revelation, you know, Christ says to one of the churches, you say that I am fine and rich and I'm in need of nothing, but you do not recognize that you are blind, naked, pitiable. Come to me, I counsel you. so that I can give you gold, so I can cover your nakedness, right? So we all acknowledge that certain things are good things and no one would deny them, right? So if we say, well, mercy, that's a good thing, and being saved is good, and forgiveness, that's really good, and we could go through the list. But what we don't like are the prerequisites to accepting those things. Because if you want to be saved, you have to be desperate. If you want to be healed, you have to be broken in some sense. If you want forgiveness, you have to be wrong. But we don't like being wrong and desperate and lost and broken. And we partly don't like doing that because we don't think there's a solution to it. And so we spend most of our lives covering up those impotencies within us that make us so embarrassed. But the good news of Christianity is we have a God who loves us as we are, and too much to leave us that way. And so we can sort of put down our fig leaves, stand before him as we are, and allow him to transform us. We don't have to be afraid. He's a loving father who desires all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. He's opened heaven under our feet. And we act too often as if it were hell that had been opened under our feet. We are indeed men of little faith. So we need a renewed confidence in the good Jesus who loves us and who is the only one who can protect us from the world, the flesh, and the devil.
That was potent, and very, very challenging to modern ears, right? As
Yeah, and
I
I mean, I know you don't care, but I just don't care about modern ears anymore. Like, I don't care. I'm not interested in defending myself, explaining myself. I mean, I'm open to offering arguments, but if they don't make sense to you, fine. Like, my arguments don't need to make sense to a person on the street for me to accept them. So this is what I think is the case. And as I share them, I'm not forcing anybody to adopt them. But I guess I would say, like, if your current set of beliefs haven't made you terribly happy, and everything you sort of try that the culture trots out as the new thing will make you happy, you try and it doesn't, then maybe just for the sake of pragmatism, give Christianity a real solid shot. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried.
the One of the things that I was struck by, I and sort of put some planks under my feet from my own faith that I didn't even realize were being put there, frankly, was I went through a period where I was producing a series of documentaries with some clients who were nonprofits and worked in really at the absolute margins of society. These were organizations that are trying to help people come out of homelessness, out of truly desperately broken. I've done several documentaries about this.
Awesome.
On or re-entering the workforce out of prison. There's a prison and entrepreneurship program out of Houston, or there's the Doe Fund in New York City that puts guys to work often off the streets, but it's in that incarceration cycle. And the thing that you couldn't escape was the power of Christian faith in these people, in these moments, that almost without exception, the person that sort of escaped alcoholism, drug abuse, being a murderer and re-entering the society and being transformed. You look at the people whose lives have been saved by the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous. It is interesting that it's like profoundly Christian in this: the first shall be last, the meek shall inherit the earth. These people who are not me, I've lived a privileged, comfortable life. These people have access to this kind of truth, the truth you're talking about. And when you look on the other side of the spectrum, our most comfortable people in our society, the silver spoons going to Columbia or Harvard, have the highest rates of mental illness, the highest, like, when if you want to say, how can I guarantee that my dart hits the target? Define, you would want a target comprised of secular, progressive, college educated, neo-Marxists. And they will guaranteed you're going to hit mental illness, just like 50-50 chance you're going to hit the bullseye with mental illness and despair, radical despair. Meanwhile, you take former inmates in a prison who have now got their lives back together, and their mental health, their sense of their identity is renewed. And I guess that's just a long way of saying that I think
It's interesting, isn't it?
that hard story you're laying out, it doesn't need to be heard as hard and judgmental and, oh, this is some Catholic scolding. But it's a road that the hard road traveled, folks will tell you, is the road that brought them back from hell. They were in hell and they came back through this.
Yeah.
Speaking of hell, there was a video by Andrew Tate in last year in which he decried Christian passivity. He's converted to Islam. Not everything Andrew Tate says is wrong. A lot of what he says is useful, but I am not a fan as a man. I think he's part of this crisis of masculinity, something I know you also talk about and care about, as do I. And he said, look, you Christians have been turning the other cheek. You have no more cheeks to turn. So how do you think about what it means to be a man and to be a Christian man and to be a strong man and a Christian man?
Yeah. Well, I don't think Christians should be taking advice from Mohammedans about how they ought to live their faith. I think we should take it from the scriptures, from the early church fathers and the saints. And so if Christ tells me to turn the cheek and some Mohammedan tells me otherwise, well, you can get on your bike, Mohammedan. I'm not terribly interested in what you have to say, unless you can elucidate it in a way that coheres with sacred scripture. Yeah, so I don't think Christianity is a religion of passivity. If somebody, actually, my wife and I were talking about this recently, someone broke into our house when we were newly married and we were in bed with our youngest son who had just been born. And the fella who broke in was a very big guy and he was loud and drunk and sounded like he was violent. And you would like to think in a situation like that, you do the right thing. But I don't know about you, but I'm not sure often. I'm like, gosh, I don't know. I'm such a coward.
Yeah.
What do I know? But I guess my wife was reminding me this of just last night. She said, I looked at her. I said, stay in here and do not open the door. I locked the door and I went out and I kind of puffed myself up and I was speaking very loudly. And I can see this brass candlestick on top of the microwave. And I'm like, all right, I want to hit him hard enough that he passes out, but not so hard that I kill him. And because I didn't have any good reason, to use that sort of force. Maybe I would have if things had escalated. Anyway, everything ended up fine. I was able to get him out of the house, and it was there was no blood shed. But yeah, a man should protect his family. And if I if I was not to do that, I'd be sinning through omission, I would say. And you can extend that out to just wars, right? Where people have not just the right, but the obligation to defend themselves and to defend those who are part of their community who are weaker than they. So all of that's true, but man's anger does not bring about the righteousness of God. Anger is a virtue when understood correctly. Thomas Aquinas talks about it as that passion which motivates us to correct a wrong. And so we see evidence of this with Christ in the temple, making the whip and driving out the money changers. But the problem is, because we're idiots, what begins as a good intention, very often the wheels fall off of it. And so we might congratulate ourselves for being so righteously angry when really we've slipped into unrighteous anger, which is a grave sin. So those would be, unless you have specifics, those would be a few thoughts that I have off the top of my head.
Well, I think one of the things, there's a lot of things that I think about as a father. I'm 47. I'm a Gen Xer, and I feel like I had the benefit of several things being Gen X. One of which was The only access to pornography I had was going to a store that would make you feel
Mhm.
really gross.
Mhm.
So there was a high cost of entrance there. Or popping open the little scramble box and taking, the pointy end of the of a fingernail clipper to try to adjust the little knob so that you could maybe catch a peek of a naked woman through the scramble. And um
Yeah,
today the
oceans
word,
of
yeah,
filth.
it's just that we are awash in in porn.
Yeah,
And awash in it in a way that's difficult. It's difficult because even at the level of you open up Instagram, and
totally.
it's not necessarily pornography, but it's just it's titillation. And I say that, and
Mhm.
I know I sound like super prudish and like an old man.
Would
um,
rather be prudish than a pervert,
but
I think.
but yeah,
Better to be neither, of course,
but
but
this is one of the things I think our boys.
mhm.
This is the world they've been born into now. The show the HBO show Euphoria is like
Dunno.
it's this it's basically a window
Yeah,
into the most depraved version of what you would hope high school isn't, but maybe sometimes is. Drug
cool.
addiction, crazy sex nonsense. It's just insane.
Yeah.
So I guess like how do you think about how do we help our boys navigate this world?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think pornography should absolutely be made illegal. How that would happen, I wouldn't know. But it seems to me that if something is destroying the fundamental building block of society, namely the family, then for the good of society, we ought to ban that thing. And then I think imprison the pimps who force us to see that kind of rubbish. When I think of pornography, I've written a book on this, by the way. It's called The Porn Myth.
Yeah.
It's a non religious response to pro porn arguments. So there's no scripture or teaching from the Bible or anything in it if people are interested. A definition of pornography that I feel somewhat satisfied with is material which depicts erotic behavior that is intended to sexually arouse. I'm not entirely happy with that, but I think it's okay as a working definition. And so, because of that, I mean, you can obviously see like a textbook that might display a naked person and that not be pornography. Or you go to the Sistine Chapel and you see breasts and buttocks and testicles, and this isn't pornography. But you can go onto Instagram and this individual has all their clothes on. But I would argue that it is pornographic if it is material which depicts erotic behavior that's intended to sexually arouse. So I think we have to talk to our children at a very young age about pornography. And I think the age of 6 is a good age because it's usually the age that they get some sort of device. Or if you're a good parent who didn't give your children a device for the age of 6, yes, that was a slight low, shame of parents who've done that. Still time to take it and smash it with a hammer, by the way. You're
Yes.
welcome to do
Yes.
that. But you could, a low key shame is what I was trying to say earlier. Yeah. So, but even if you don't give them a device, they usually have access to some device that will access pornography. So, what do you do? How do you talk to children about pornography in a way that doesn't scandalize them or put ideas in their head that they need not have? I think you can do it actually. I mean, like we actually talk about all sorts of horrific things to children in age appropriate ways, things that are even worse than pornography. Like, if you go to some public event like a baseball game or a concert, you might say to your child, "Hey, don't run away from dad because there could be a bad man who could take you away from us." Like that's a horrific thing to say,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually.
It's
Um,
nightmare fuel.
yeah, but you don't get into the details because that would be inappropriate as to what you mean and what that might look like. Okay, so if we can do that about abduction and predation, we can do that about pornography. And so here's a way you might do it. You might say, "Hey, buddy, you know how there are good pictures, like photos of mom and dad and the family, and maybe illustrations from your favorite comic book or something. Well, there are also bad pictures, and some bad pictures are called pornography. Pornography is pictures or videos that show parts of our bathing suit. That show part of our body that our bathing suit should cover." And if you ever see this or if someone ever shows it to you, make sure you tell mom and dad. We'd be really proud of you for doing that. You might think you'd be in trouble, but you wouldn't be in trouble. We'd just be really grateful that you told us that because pornography can actually hurt our brains just like we always wear a bike helmet when we go on a bike ride because we want to hurt the outside of our head. Well, this thing called pornography it's actually been scientifically shown to damage the inside of our head. So we don't want that for you. So yeah, you should just always tell us, and we'd be really proud of you for doing that. All right, so that's like a really, really simplified, basic overview, but it's something anyone can tell their children, and I think it's important that we do that. We don't want to be untwisting the perversion that we've allowed the internet to teach our children about sexuality. What we want to do is teach them the beauty of human sexuality, and when they encounter the perversion, will hopefully therefore see it as such. And we also want our children to know that we love them and they can always come to us if they're struggling with something like this.
It's this how to have self-control and not act on your most basic impulses feels to me like among the definitions of what it means to be an adult.
Mm.
In a perfect sense. We all fail at this. All of us have things that we're tempted by: food, alcohol,
Yeah.
playing video games too long when I need to get work done. You name it. There's a temptation that we all fail on. But it does feel to me, and I've thought about that. I'm almost constantly thinking about what is the right way to understand what it means to be an adult. In part because I feel like our culture has abandoned a shared definition of being an adult that is literally shared, such that you don't need to enumerate it, but we all kind of know. We have like the remnants of it in the inverse, in the sense that I think most people, if you ask them, what does it mean to act like a baby? They can rattle it off. Oh yeah, if you throw temper tantrums, if if you can't control yourself, if you don't have any patience and you need everything right now, like you're kind of acting like a baby. But like when you dig into that, it is like all like social media, the immediacy of what, like, immediate gratification has come to define 21st century life. And pornography is like the most vicious, in a lot of ways, examples of it. I don't think I could. My more classical liberal streak recoils at prohibition. It tends to have perverse outcomes, but
Yeah, and that's something to take into consideration. In the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas talks about whether or not prostitution should be uh, made illegal, and he quotes Augustine. It's funny. Here's what Aquinas says. I think I disagree with him, but you might agree with him. He quotes Augustine as saying something to the effect of that it shouldn't be made illegal, but it should be quadranted off. Now, his basic point seems to be because by making it illegal, you would actually bring about maybe more intense ills than you otherwise would by permitting it. The kind of the consequences he gives, I don't necessarily agree with, but that's the basic point. And so I think there is merit to that, right? Like, I mean, just because something's just because something's immoral doesn't mean it should be illegal. Like if you were to try to criminalize adultery, say, like, how would you go about that in a way that wouldn't actually be a terrifying imposition upon most normal men and women? And you might not be able to do that. I don't think you could do that, which is why it's probably good, I would say, that adultery isn't illegal. And so I'm open to that with pornography, but it just increasingly I'm of the opinion that it is toxic filth that we don't even have a choice to see anymore. It comes looking for us. And because it perverts that action, which unites man and woman and creates families, I do think it should be banned. But I'm open to being corrected or chided about that if you want.
I think it points to something. We could spend another hour having a debate about prohibitionism and whatnot, but I think what it points to instead is something that is maybe a good place as we start to wrap up our time together, and that is, the show's called Dad Saves America, not because I'm always talking about politics, but because I do believe that this is the role that we play as men and as Americans is interconnected. that healthy masculinity, that fatherhood, that that the family, that these are the bedrocks of the West, of a healthy, flourishing society, whether it's West or East, um, and that faith is a big part of that. But in the American tradition, which I would say this might no longer be technically true, but we have been and maybe still are the freest country in the world in terms of legal protection for the individual to choose their own path, to do, say, consume, create whatever we want, so long as we don't hurt anybody else. One definition of sort of a kind of libertarian ethos is you're allowed to do anything peaceful or anything that doesn't hurt others. And I think that the founders, we have to some degree lost, I think, an assumption that the founders all had, which was that freedom only worked in the service of human flourishing for a moral people, for a people who didn't need to have their morality legislated, because you would be ashamed to go into the nudie bar. Yes, it's over in that part of the neighborhood, and if you're a pillar of the community and you're seen going there, it's bad for you, and it's bad for you, and yes, so you don't. And so like freedom and non-coercive or less coercive, let's say, forms of judgment, including the judgment of your church, the judgment of the laws of Moses, were there. They were operational. If you just had I can do whatever I want, and so long as I'm not physically hurting you, you shall not pass judgment on me. I don't think any of the founders, I know this, the founders would have said, our system of government can't constrain that society. That society will fall like Babylon. How do you think about that? How do you think about the relationship between sort of what we call civilization and the moral norms that are the focus of this conversation and of the teachings of Christianity, and not just Christianity, but obviously as Christians and as Catholics, that's our worldview. How do you think about those two things and the feedback loop they're in together?
Yeah, great points. Yeah, I think freedom we often think of in the negative sense. Like things shouldn't infringe upon my rights. I shouldn't be forced to do what I don't want to do. And fair enough. There's a lot to be said about that. But we often don't think of it in its positive sense. Like I remember Archbishop Fulton Sheen making this joke. He said, "You don't go out onto the street in New York City, see a cab driver, and say, 'Are you free?' And when he says yes, you say, 'Hooray for freedom!' It doesn't make any sense. Like freedom exists for something. It's not just about what's not being done. It's about what ought to be done. So St. John Paul II said that freedom exists for the sake of love, not for the sake of making ourselves worse."
Yeah, I think for people who are not familiar with, or either are unfamiliar with, or only have a kind of pop culture passing sense of Catholicism, would be surprised by how every mass is basically a celebration of love in virtually every instance of the activity. Love is well, how do you think about it? How do you think about what the role that love plays in the faith?
All right, it's a big question, and I'll do my best. 1 John chapter 4, verses 8 and 16. Twice in the same chapter, St. John says, not that God is lovely, although he is, or that he's lovable, although he is. He says God is love, which is wild, actually. What does it mean to say God is love? Well, for love to exist, there needs to be three things. There needs to be the one who loves, the lover, the one who is loved, the beloved, and then the love that they share. Well, God is tripersonal. You have the Father from all eternity who loved the Son. The Son from all eternity receives this love and gives it back to the Father. And from all eternity, this procession from both Father and Son is the third person, the Holy Spirit. And so we've been made in the image and likeness of love. So I give myself to my bride on our wedding night, say, and her receptivity of that is not passive, it's active. It's an active receptivity in which she gives her love back to me. And that love is so powerful that sometimes 9 months later, you need to give it a name. So we've been made in the image and likeness of love. And we see that in our very interactions of male and female. This God who is love, when we turned our back on him and chose not life, which would seem to mean death, chose to, give us the patriarchs and the prophets to get us back on track. And then finally, his full revelation was given to us in the person of Jesus Christ. So if you want to know what God's like, you just have to look at Jesus, right? Our blessed Lord said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." And what do you see when you look at this Jesus? You see someone who ate with sinners, who was kind to outsiders, who wasn't chiding them. He also didn't mince words, right? Like, so he
Yeah.
says to the woman caught in adultery, "Does anyone condemn you? Neither do I condemn you." But then he always says, "But go sin no more." But there's always this like this lead in of love, like you are cherished, you are desired, you are found pleasing to me. Uh, that's why I said earlier, who loves us as we are and too much to leave us that way. So the commands of God and Christianity, they aren't harsh, they're urgent. And sometimes, sure, bad Christians or Christians who've said things poorly may have made them appear harsh. And we're all sinners who are heralds of the gospel. And so we have to be careful not to do that. And if we do, to repent of it. But it is an urgent message to get your life back on track. But it's not a Pelagian heretical call to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Rather, it's to recognize that only in Christ and Christ alone do we find a refuge for our tired, frightened little hearts. We won't find it in drink or doom scrolling or binge watching or popularity or money or any of that. And and those of us who've lived longer than 5 minutes have tried some of these things enough to realize we're still desperately not happy or unfulfilled. It's only in Christ, Jesus, that we can find that fulfillment. I forget the Old Testament scripture. Someone can remind us in the comments where our blessed Lord says, "My people have committed two evils. They have abandoned me, the font of living water, and they've created cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns, which don't hold any water." And that to me sums us up. We keep trying to do it our way. We keep turning from the font of living water, life himself, and we just keep trying to set up Eden where Eden cannot be set up. It won't work. And so I think what we have to do is to repent of that exercise and turn back to the refuge that Jesus Christ is and say, "Father, I surrender myself to you. I release everything to you. I don't even know what I'm saying as I say these words, and I don't even know if I mean them, but I know I love you and I know I want more of you. So give me yourself and do in me what I've been unable to do in me because apparently you're that good. Amen." Something like that. I think those really honest prayers are what our Father loves to hear.
I have been struck by, and you get this by reading the Gospels and also by watching the show The Chosen. You get these things. How often we hear Christ talk about not just giving you peace, but relieving you of your anxiety.
Mm.
And it strikes the ear now at a time when
Yeah.
anxiety and depression have are epidemic, and I think that's legitimate. It's very easy. Everyone likes to say there's crises, everything's a crisis, but I think when it comes to anxiety and depression, there is very much a very real increase, especially with our kids. And it is as if it was said then for us now, almost like intensely, like, hey, you are trapped in anxiety, in the catastrophizing of your mind. Like, I will bring you peace. And that is man, I believe it,
Mm.
but it's profoundly modern, a call, right? And I think what you said about love is so beautiful. It's a great place for us to wrap things up. I have one last question for you, Matt. I ask this of every guest. As I was saying earlier, the show's called Dad Saves America because I think that is a role we play that is heroic and that has an impact on the whole of society when we strive to live up to what it can be. Nobody's ever perfect. How do you think about your role, not just as a father, although that might be fine, but your role in general in the American story? You have chosen to come to America. You have said how much you enjoy it here, so it's even better. Whenever I've got a first generation immigrant, I'm that much more excited to
Yes.
ask this question.
Yeah, it occurred to me recently that I could play that victim card whenever I want. I am an immigrant, and I'm super grateful to be. I love living here. It seems to me that America is obviously the most powerful country in the world, not just militarily, but also in how it influences the world through its music and through its movies, but much more besides. I mean, when I was in Australia recently, everyone I met with, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of people I met with would say, Bishop Robert Barron's helped me a great deal. Father Mike Schmitz and Ascension Presents have helped me a great deal. Brent Horn or the work of Focus or um, Scott Hahn's St. Paul Center. And I know some of these names aren't familiar with all of your viewers, but just to say, like, America has this beautiful entrepreneurial spirit. You look at all of the inventions Americans came up with, like the dishwasher was made by some Italian broad in Chicago. Good on you. That's awesome. And now we're all adopting it. And I feel like Americans have to stop apologizing for their influence in the world, unless it's evil, and then we should definitely apologize.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's good, and we should be so grateful for that. So, I remember mourning the fact that I wouldn't live in my country with my wife, that I wouldn't get to evangelize in my country. But the good Jesus has seen it such that I'm able to be, I think, a better evangelist from my little studio here in Florida than I would be if I had have never came to America. So it's provided me that opportunity, and I'm very grateful for it. So that's, I suppose, how I see what is my role in the American story. I want to love my wife well. I want to love my children well and apologize when I fail them. And I want to lead them through this worn, torn wasteland to heaven. They are under my authority. I want to take my responsibility very seriously, and I want to encourage others to do the same. And if they choose not to, that's their choice, but this is the choice I want to make. Yeah.
Matt Fradd, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciated chatting with you.